Okay, I have it noon, so let us soon start with our contributed workshop by Fiore Longo. And here I want to express my thanks to Laura Tersani, who brought us into contact with Fiore. And I've just heard that Francis Schomet Naingisa won't be joining us, but Sara Cordovez will be. And as a third speaker in this workshop, we have Carola Rackete from Nature Needs Justice. Whom of you do I give the floor to first? Carola, Fiore.
Carola, you can go first. I don't have any problem. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Really nice to see you. I already had a good morning listening to some of the contributions. Yeah, it says workshop here, but I think we're more aiming for a discussion round or so. I think we have inputs from 3 different activist campaigns, which I'm really happy that we can share with you. So we're speaking a little bit about that. I think each of us will maybe speak just 5 or 7 minutes, and then you could ask questions. But then we also would like to discuss with you and really have some exchange of opinions and ideas, really. And I hope that it will be interesting for all of us. So my name is Carola. I'm here today on behalf of a campaign that we have called Nature Needs Justice, for lack of a different name. We have started it as a social media campaign basically 1 year ago within the Extinction Rebellion in Germany, mainly for lack of a different platform, I have to say, because the very few people who are part of this campaign also have been quite critical of the rebellion because of their sometimes very questionable stance and comments on issues like migration and anti-racism and so on. However, we see this campaign, which we started, as a 2-step campaign, basically. The first part is the idea to educate the climate justice movement or anyone interested, newly interested in issues of climate or environment. And then as a second step, hopefully to do some direct actions and practical things, because we are well aware that within academic spaces, the shortcomings of the conservation industry are well known, but that is often not so much translated into something easily understandable. And that is what we were hoping to do with this campaign. I'm gonna just put the link of the website in the chat so you can check it out sometime. We are also happy to receive some feedback on it, also improvements and suggestions. So we have made a lot of short texts and videos as well for social media, for YouTube and so on, that we have shared. We are also doing webinars and workshops, for example, in climate camps, climate movement spaces, because we realized that even within that those activist spaces, the idea that not everyone in nature conservation is doing a great job is not common knowledge. So then the reason that we have called this campaign Nature Needs Justice is really that we are aiming to the point that everyone who thinks about climate and instantly thinks climate justice will do the same at some point with nature conservation, so that anytime when somebody suggests a solution to deal with nature conservation or the biodiversity crisis, we want people to think about the aspect of justice, and in particular about the land rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, but also about the human rights abuses, which at times have been carried out, which have certainly occurred and which are not so known, and which some of the conservation organizations have not made a lot of effort to clean up and investigate. So this is the reason for this campaign which we're having. And as part of this campaign, we have also had one topic or subtopic of alternative economics and a focus on overconsumption, economic growth, and the roots of the destruction of ecosystems because of the capitalist economic system that we are in, and how if we in the global north wanted to contribute to nature conservation, we would not only need to try to conserve the species, but also really change our economic system in the way that IPBES, for example, has told us in their report. So yeah, that is basically at this point the campaign which we're running. We have seen a little bit of success within the climate movement here in Germany. We have had several online workshops and so on. We see that people are becoming a bit more critical, but also even within the climate space, it is quite a niche topic to engage with. And we have actually had less of a reach than we were hoping to, but we are still continuing basically with this phase of education, and particularly now that we are able to move into offline spaces again and meet people and discuss. This is probably what we're going to do in the future, but we're still quite a bit far away from actually having enough people who would be able to and ready to take action, direct actions or protests in a physical form, I have to say. So that's a kind of overview of what the campaign has been doing so far, and I would like to pass on to Fiore then.
Thank you very much, Carola. Hello, everyone. My name is Fiore Longo. I'm campaigner at Survival International. I am very happy actually to be here. It's a long time we have been thinking about the possible links between the degrowth movement and the degrowth theory and biodiversity conservation. So I would really like that after our talks, then we can have a very long debate. So I would just explain what Survival does, and then what our campaign that we call Decolonizing conservation, what this campaign is about. And so I will also put some two links here in this chat. One about the campaign we are doing now called the Big Green Lie, and there is a nice video that you can watch there, and then another from an alternative congress that we are organizing. For the ones who haven't ever heard about Survival, Survival is the global movement for indigenous peoples. What our goal is to change public opinion, to radically change public opinion in the so-called industrialized countries, or whatever name we want to give to those countries of the mostly global north. We are convinced that the roots of the problems that indigenous peoples are facing, especially racism, are actually here, and so in the Western countries. So we are the ones who need to change. So we don't do any kind of project on indigenous people land. We are here to change public opinion, and we do that through education and through campaigning. So sometimes we go to the field, we collect information about human rights abuses, or other of all sorts of kind, like land theft, torture, and other things, and then we come back and we try to make those things stop. Our conservation campaign actually starts from this very human rights perspective. Now I would say it's much wider. We start noticing that there were evictions from indigenous peoples from protected areas, the so-called protected areas, or national parks, wildlife reserves, around 30 years ago. We wrote our first letter to WWF, I think 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. What we thought it was an isolated case, you know, a reserve, a national park in the middle of nowhere in Cameroon, where the Baka were evicted. It ended up being a systematic, actually, problem. We have been in protected areas all across Africa, and also in Asia, in a lot of countries like India, Nepal, Myanmar. And we have collected a lot of testimonies of indigenous people that have been evicted from their land to make room to a national park. It can sound crazy, because we all know that the 80% of biodiversity is in indigenous people's land, and they are by far the best guardians of natural world, but unfortunately this is what's happening. And when we ask why, I think this is the interesting thing. For a long time, survival, I'm including my own organization, but we have been focusing on the abuses committed by park rangers. So we thought the problems are the park rangers that are violating the right of indigenous people, so the militarization of the nature conservation. But actually, I do think that that was also a very colonial approach to the problem, because it was a little bit of the more blaming Africans and blaming, you know, the local people for what was going on. If we start looking deeper in the problem, and we realize it's not just, so the abuses are the type of the iceberg. What we are facing is an ideology that separates human from nature. So it says nature is something abstract or wild, as it was called for a long time, and we need to, and humans are destroying nature. So we need to separate these two things. The first national parks were born actually in the United States, where indigenous people were evicted in the name of this wilderness. Of course, wilderness was only in the eyes of the white people. Those lands we know today were not wild at all, were not empty. They were people that had been shaped this environment for generations. And this kind of narrative, you know, humans are the virus, humans are destroying nature, actually is hidden the fact that it's not human in general, but it's a particular economical system that is destroying nature. Not all humans are destroying nature. A lot of humans in the world are living in a way that respect nature and in an interaction with the environment that respect both humans and nature. So behind this wilderness idea, of course, there is racism, that there was racism. This is what the way that European colonization can say that those lands belong to them, because there was no one living there. And since the colonization of Africa, but also America, Europeans decided to create spaces where they could hunt or they could enjoy nature in an aesthetical way, evicting the people or denying the role that those people have in those environments. And so what happened is that this is not a story of the past. We can think that happened in the colonization, but unfortunately, this is still the case today. We still think that Western science and Western countries can protect nature better than Africans, and actually the entire conservation, especially after the colonization, was based on now the African countries are independent. We need to protect Africa from Africans because they won't know how to do it. And so a lot of these conservation projects are actually written in Brussels or in Washington, where someone decide how nature should be protected. And the truth is that we end up protecting nature from local people, who are the ones who are dependent on nature, and they're the best place to protect it, and not protecting nature from our own economies and our own multinational companies that are destroying actually the planet. And if we look at the proposal, so that's why I'm saying it's not a story of the past. Today, we have these very important topics that we should be addressing, like climate, like biodiversity loss. And instead of that, we keep pushing a model of protecting nature that it's unrealistic, and actually is not going to work, because we can't separate nature issues from social justice issues, from economical issues. They're not two different things. There's not nature belonging to biology and then human beings belonging to social science. We have to understand that if we need to protect nature, we can't just be focusing on creating this kind of spaces without human beings every now and then. In this particular case, in the 30% of the world and forgetting what is happening in the other 70%. I think that this kind of push for the 30%, which is now the new solution that conservation organizations and governments came up with, it means doubling the number of protected areas, is not going to work. Why is not going to work? First of all, it's every evidence we have today showing that indigenous territories, recognized indigenous territories, are protecting nature better than protected areas. So protected areas is a specific category, or there are 4 categories, but 5, sorry. And in most of the cases, there are no human activity that is allowed inside, even sustainable activities. So instead of saying, well, look what is working today, indigenous territories, let's push for indigenous territories recognition, we are pushing for something that is not working. We have today 17% of the planet as protected area, and the biodiversity loss rates are worse than ever. Because we can't just look to what happened in the protected area, we have to look what is going on around. And all these 30% theories, but also others like planting more trees or whatever, are sometimes pushed by also business. I think that the conversation, and that's why I'm so happy we are talking about, the conversation about protecting nature should go through and start with, let's see what is going on here in the global north, what we are doing, why biodiversity is getting lost in the first place. And then we can come up with solutions. Any other solution that actually divert the attention from the real problem, which is the overconsumption and the exploitation of resource, is not really a real conversation. And on top of all of that, we have the human rights abuses that I have been telling you about in the protected areas. We are seeing people losing their lands, their way of life, and also due to the increasing militarization, we have tortures and extrajudicial killings happening in those areas where there are people living there that doesn't have any role in the climate crisis or biodiversity loss. And I think that this human rights tragedy is not just a tragedy from a human rights perspective, but also from a biodiversity perspective, because I think we survival are convinced that without diversity, human diversity, there is no room for biodiversity either. And so I will share with you, and that's all, the Big Green Lie campaign. And just to let you know, we are organizing also a congress about all these topics on the 2nd September. I also put the link in the chat, so you can also participate online, and we will be discussing about decolonizing conservation and an alternative to these kind of solutions, or so-called solutions that are coming from the IUCN or from politicians and business. So we want to build another kind of alternative that respect both nature and human rights. That's it from me. So there is no other speaker, right?
I believe there is, or right, Carola? Sara, I believe volunteered as a 3rd speaker, as Francis Chomet couldn't make it after all. So Sara, the room is yours. The floor is yours.
I am very sorry that I'm not but yes, to be here anyway. My name is Sara Cordovez Lopez. I'm from Colombia.
So at the moment, we do not really hear you.
Is it any better?
Slightly.
Slightly?
Perhaps put off. Yeah, okay.
This?
Yes, let us try. No, I'm sorry. You seem to need either another microphone or
How
better
about this?
connection. Yes,
Yeah,
that makes a big change. Thank you.
great. No, of course. But yeah, hi everyone. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I apologize that Shomit couldn't make it here today. He is a Maasai elder and currently working incredibly long hours around the evictions that are happening in Tanzania at the moment, where 80,000 people are due to be evicted within the next couple of months through a proposal that is being pushed by the UNESCO and the IUCN to turn the Ngorongoro Park and the Ngorongoro Conservation Area into a no people zone, driven by the discourse of the carrying capacity of the ecosystem having been reached, which we understand sort of how it links to the overpopulation argument, which again links to ecofascism. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about that after I tell you a little bit about the What the Fuck WWF campaign. So the What the Fuck WWF campaign is a youth-led organization. We are a group, a direct action group, none of us born after 1995. And we work in direct partnership and solidarity with indigenous communities across East Africa. At the moment, we are working with the Gababandi Association, with the PALCA, the Pan-African Living Cultures Alliance, and the Sengwer People's Program in Kenya. And we are also working with the Guarani community, with the Ivirupa Commission in Sao Paulo, in Southeast Brazil. And what we do as a campaign, we truly believe in the power of direct action. We understand the way in which the failures of conservation, the human rights and biodiversity rights failure of conservation that both Carola and Fiore so eloquently put, they are known within academic spaces. They are also largely known within NGO spaces, but they are not very widely known among the general population. And we truly do believe that direct action is a powerful way to bring the conversation to people's tables, basically. We are targeting WWF because of the human rights abuses that they have perpetrated across East Africa and Asia, especially South Asia. And because WWF is the conservation organization that is mostly funded by private donors, that means that they are the middlemen between people here in the UK that care deeply about the state of wildlife, that want to do something about it. They are the middlemen that then use those funds, either 35% of it for marketing or a lot of it for equipment to militarize conservation, or to create sort of greenwashing programs so that organizations, very polluting organizations, can continue the plunder. How it links, so basically the whole idea of the campaign is to show people here in the UK that are funding the destruction, to show them that they have more in common with people on the ground, with the guardians of the forest, with the communities in resistance than they do with WWF. So to a very large extent here, I think we're talking about how the conservation paradigm fits with the imperiale Lebensweise, the imperial way of life that is built on racial capitalism expressed through colonialism. So when we think about the fact that capitalism necessitates inequality and racism enshrines it, that's a quotation by Ruth Wilson Gilmer, a critical race scholar. When we think about that, how then we can start to think about the colonial sort of relationship that exists in biodiversity conservation, a relationship that is hindered and hidden away by sort of the hubris of point zero, as anti-colonial scholars call it, the hubris of science as imperial science, a scientific paradigm that erases indigenous knowledge and indigenous systems of knowledge in favor of irrationality that is born out of out of the patriarchal dominance and the Cartesian mind-body split. So what all of that means, all of that theory that we can talk about for a very long time, what all of that means is that the plunder, the neo-colonial plunder of land and livelihoods and ways of living is still happening. The genocide hasn't stopped. And to that extent, we can talk about the fact that what we are continuing to do to a very large extent in the decolonized conservation, like wider movement, of which What the Fuck WWF is a part of, or is trying to be a part of. We can talk about decolonizing conservation as a continuation of the resistance that started in 1492 with the plunder of the so-called Americas, Avia Yala. So how I'm really excited to learn more about the perspectives of how degrowth fits and post-growth fits into that picture. As both speakers have said, the capitalist system in which we live is an integral part of how we understand nature, and is an integral part that enables the destruction of livelihoods and connection to land. I think maybe the last sort of point that I want to say is the fact that, as Fiore was saying, the problem is here. For example, here in the UK, the enclosure movement took away the possibility of the peasant class to be able to sustain themselves through the privatization of land. So then everyone had to migrate to the cities to work, to engage in wage labor at the dawn of capitalism. So when we start thinking about how do we deal with what has happened, I think an interesting way of thinking about it might be around reparatory justice and what that means. So I don't necessarily know if I've reached my time. I assume I have, but I would love to hear more about the connections between post-growth and the conservation paradigm, and especially the question around reparatory justice and how reparatory justice fits into post-growth. And just to say that by reparatory justice, I mean holistic reparation, planet repairs. It's never been only about money for us in the majority world. It's always been about healing the harm and stopping the harm. I look forward to listening to all of you. And again, thank you very much for having me.
I don't know how the question part works, but we were more. I see there are some questions there, but I think I can reply to that in the chat. Maybe we can. I can also leave you my email for specific questions about survival. I was more thinking that this would be with Carola, that what we have discussed, right? And more a space of debate about how can concretely we can like how concretely the growth movement can contribute to also to shift the debate in conservation, and what we can do, of like what actions we can take together, like to put together these the people working on different topics. So I don't know, and also if you have comments on how we can better link the conservation issues with the degrowth movement, and how can we make the conversation move forward. We were hoping more in a debate. I don't know if that's clear.
Is it okay to start with some questions? Or do you want to, what kind of direction would you like? Because I'm very curious. I have one question.
Yeah, I think it's fine. Right?
Okay, so these notions about how our efforts to conserve nature are actually working in an adverse way are of course really important. And I think one may wonder whether there's a systemic element of the way we, especially in the global north, do things. Or whether there is a kind of, I don't believe in a negative willingness to for instance, negatively affect the lives of indigenous people who live in these areas. And I'm very curious to the science base of this, but I am aware that this is happening. But what is a very interesting element we engaged in is that nature itself cannot defend itself. Humans can collect and form alliances and reach out through various channels to point out the abuses that may happen to them. But nature can't. Nature doesn't have a voice. And in this respect, it's really interesting that more and more people seem to embrace the idea that nature should have their own legality. Rivers should have their rights, and nature reserves should be having their rights. And there are some examples of legal entities that have been assigned to rivers that are actually commanded by indigenous local people. Do you have any collaboration with that, or any views on this development to really legalize, provide a legal voice for nature and for rivers, etc.?
I don't know who wants you to go first. I can talk about survival views in this ecocide thing. I have to say we are in dialogue with the people from ecocide and trying to understand better, because we have some concerns about it. One of it is that we haven't managed until today to respect indigenous people's rights. So why we think that having a legal framework for nature would protect better those environments than a framework that is protecting indigenous peoples living in those environments. So just one is a question of efficacy, and then who is the voice of the nature? If tomorrow WWF could just perfectly say the BAC are harming nature. So in the name of this ecocide thing, because they're hunters, they're hunter-gatherers, and we decide to do a legal action against them or whoever. So who is deciding what nature is? Especially because nature doesn't have a voice. I find this a little bit tricky. At the same time, I do understand and I see that we have to do something against multinational companies that are destroying the life of those people. But I don't know if adding. So I wouldn't say. We are not against it. I'm just saying we are having an internal conversation about it. It's not very easy, because I don't know how adding another kind of legal framework for something that it has already a framework. There is the ILO 169, the Universal Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights, that protect the life and the lands of the people that are proved today to be the ones taking care better of nature. So, for example, today the Yanomami have seen their river poisoned, and we have the legal conventions and also internal Brazilian laws that could protect their river to be poisoned, because this would harm the Yanomami and harm their environment, and we can't do anything about it. So I don't know how adding another, doing a legal suit in the name of the river can improve the thing. So it just, I don't know. This is what, so our concerns. And also the other concern is a lot of crimes are being committed in the name of nature. Who is speaking for the nature? But this said, I do think that the ecocide movement is bringing an important conversation that we should be having. I don't know if that replied to the question.
I see that Sara has also raised her hand and perhaps likes to respond to the same question. There are also some questions appearing in the chat, but first, Sara, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, I think to the rights, like nature rights question, I think I would sort of ask a wider set of questions around sort of trying to think critically around things. Maybe to what extent is our understanding of the legality of harm based around a conception of liberalism? I would ask around the idea of the legal system as an imposed sort of objectivity grid over the world, which I think is an understanding that does not match the reality, for example, of places like Colombia, my home, where there is no doubt in my mind that the legal system that emerges out of the colonization process is based on racial capitalism expressed through colonialism, and is based on the elites mostly. For example, even just how we understand human rights, for example, the story that we hear about human rights in the West, here in Europe, is the fact that the French Revolution started it. But a critical understanding of Abya Yala, that is so-called Latin American history, we know that human rights were first enshrined in the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian state, which actually today is the anniversary of the Haitian Revolution, was the very first state to enshrine equality within its human rights and within its constitution. So I guess that would be my main question. How can we go further than just rely on a legal system that is based on liberalism that we know never included the majority world? So why would it include it now? How can we go a little bit beyond that and start thinking, for example, a lot of what we've thought about lately and that we've instated around how we understand power and how we understand decision making? So I think I would answer that question with a challenge to maybe start thinking about a global citizens assembly to decide what conservation paradigm we will have. A global citizens assembly that is based on the best available knowledge and the best critical thinking. Because as Fiore was saying, the minute we start thinking, the minute we start understanding nature rights within the current liberal paradigm, there needs to be a nature expert. And that nature expert will almost always come from the natural sciences. So how can we start thinking differently around stopping the harm and the decision making around it in a way that socializes power, like this global citizens assembly could possibly do?
Yeah, if I may react, it's a really beautiful, idealistic view. But to reach that view, we to materialize this view. Of course, the way will be very long. You may recognize it. So even from a more pragmatic perspective, if we don't, this symposium is of course mainly about biodiversity. So I keep the focus a bit there, if you don't mind. But if we want to conserve the biodiversity and we acknowledge there is abuse and there are systematic wrongdoings, which may be either the effect of systems, political systems, ideologies, or just of the system themselves. Is it then not pragmatic to at least provide a legal base for those that have no voice, and indeed put the force, the power of that legal base of the indigenous in the hands of the indigenous people who form a forum that represent, for instance, the river in your home country? Do you see the point?
Apologies.
Pardon?
No, of course. I'm very sorry.
Sorry, it's I cannot hear. I cannot hear your voice again. Yes, this is better.
Sorry, is this any better? Yes.
This is much better. Yes.
Great. Of course, I understand sort of the merits of the legal strategy.
Okay. I think Sarah will try to be back in any minute, but perhaps meanwhile, we can move the discussion to some of the other questions that were
Sure.
posted in the chat. Starting with a question from Stephen. If you like to unmute and ask the question yourself, you are very welcome to do so.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. To all the speakers, I think it's really important to be having this discussion. And so to kind of further and kind of get to grips with some of the tricky bits, I wondered about, well, Carola and Fiore and Sara, what have you found useful in the degrowth movement? And especially what do you think is more tricky in trying to draw from the degrowth movement in order to advance the cause of decolonizing conservation? Hope my question is clear enough to answer. Thank you.
Carola, do you want to go first? I feel I talked a lot, but I can also talk, but I don't know if you want to.
Well, in my perspective, degrowth and the whole debate on human rights, decolonization, protection of the environment just come to the same point, but from very different starting points. But they're basically extremely connected. But I think often when people, particularly in academia, but also in activist spaces, like to focus on one particular topic. And it's very difficult, I think, also in the way that media works to connect all these issues. And I think what needs to happen is to apply more of a yes and strategy whenever it's possible. It's mainly about narratives really and media work. I think when we're saying like, yes, we really need the biodiversity conservation because the state of species is terrible. The state of ecosystems is really bad and worsening. The trends are worsening. But also scrutinizing each and every solution that is being proposed. And that is the same as in the climate space, where we have a lot of false solutions being proposed and where we have a lot of like organizations or NGOs which are pushing for solutions that we cannot support, starting from carbon capture, which is hardly impossible or hardly possible, or geoengineering, or we have seen even big conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy selling meaningless carbon credits. And it's also not new. I mean, this has been reported by people like operating, for example, REDD monitors since like 20 years or so. It's absolutely not new. So I think we have to hold accountable the actors within the conservation industry. And I really mean when I say industry, because it has become a business, even though there are very many well-meaning people who are working in these organizations, and some organizations are also really big, having a lot of different sections which are operating differently. So I mean, for example, WWF in Ukraine is not the same as WWF maybe somewhere in India. And I wouldn't hold the individual person somewhere working on freshwater in Ukraine responsible for what is happening somewhere else. but I think we really have to scrutinize all the solutions which are being proposed. And we, particularly in the global north, when I say we, as activists in the global north, we have to highlight the fact how much of this environmental destruction is rooted in the economic capitalist system and the need to ever expand and extract, and that this yes and strategy clearly needs to say, and many biodiversity papers do say that, I think, like, yes, we need to protect nature. Yes, we need to do something against overconsumption in the global north. And also, yes, and we need to protect human rights. And for me as an activist, it is important to support marginalized communities, like those people who do not have much opportunity or platform to raise their concerns and to support their demands. So the demands of indigenous peoples, for example, clearly are their land rights being protected. So that is what we should push for and support instead of bringing on our own agenda. And with that, I will close to leave some room for other speakers. I hope I have answered at least a little bit of the question.
I think so. And if I understand the question by Maria correctly, it was a little bit along the same lines or same flavor. So how do we avoid infighting within the conservation community so that we can be united against the worst offenders?
Well, I think that also we need to talk about funding. I think that we shouldn't forget that the problem here is also that conservation organizations are mostly funded or they're doing partnerships with people that are the people that should be accountable, or the organizations and multinational companies that should be held accountable for what is going on. And I think that is part of what we would need to do. We can't, well, there are several things. One of the things that, as Carola said, the way that the debate is framed is like completely wrong. We can't talk about conservation, as I said, without talking about economics, about social justice. For me, it's very surreal to see a biodiversity policy that doesn't address at all the real cause of the biodiversity loss. We are talking about climate change, and there is nothing about reducing emissions. We are talking about biodiversity loss. There is nothing about to stop overconsumption. So I think that the way that the debate has been framed is like conservation is about animals and about plants and not about humans. And I think that is completely wrong. This is one of the things. And the other thing that could, move the conversation forward and without fighting with the conservation communities, like we are not here telling everyone in the conservation that cares about conservation, you are doing bad or you are human rights abusers. It's not what is going on. Is that a certain model of conservation could be responsible for human rights abuses in the way that has been implemented. But we are here to move the conversation forward and say we can't talk about conservation if we don't talk about people and about justice and about human rights. But the other thing is that we have to look at the funding. We can't be letting these organizations that are funded by government, the same governments accountable for the situation we are today, to be deciding what the debate is about. There is a conflict of interest if WWF, I'm talking about WWF because it's the most known, but we can say WCS, African Parks. If you look who is in the board of these organizations, if you look who is funding these organizations, there is no doubt that these organizations can't have any kind of voice in a debate about capitalism, because they are I don't know, the same people that brought that here. So I think that this is another of the things that we should be discussing, is like, how can we make, how can we avoid this conflict of interest from happening? When the European Commission is saying that they want to create more parks in Africa, and then, or they can want to plant more trees, or they can do what to sell to offset their emissions, is that something that we can is something that we want, or we should be first asking European Commission to stop the destruction of the environment, and then we can talk about conservation in other parts. I find that without looking at the funding, it's also very, very tricky to have a real debate about conservation. I don't know if I explained myself.
Well, I think quite clearly. We have next question by Jocelyn. Would you like to unmute, Jocelyn?
Hi everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to ask the question. Yeah, I guess it's more like kind of like a moving forward, following on from Maria's question, kind of like, you know, a lot of what you've presented here. So I'll come out and say I consider myself to be a conservationist, and I'm currently a PhD student. So, you know, I'm trying to engage with these issues of not wanting to further colonial conservation and all these grave injustices. But I think a lot of the campaigns, you know, you are about bringing awareness to the public about, you know, how terrible WWF and several other big international NGOs are for conservation. But as somebody, what one of the keynote speakers, James Allen, spoke before about, in some ways, you know, he was saying that, well, you still need some strict protected areas because you've got bulldozers coming in, and you've got a lot of very powerful economic actors coming in to extract and I guess cause planetary harm. So what kind of solutions do your organization see, like beyond, you know, because there is already in some ways lip service paid with discussions about 30 by 30. You know, they do have language, or the language surrounding these policy documents do contain, you know, disclaimers like, oh, you know, we don't mean to displace people, or that we do recognize IPLCs as the best protectors of the forest, etc. But, you know, that in some ways that is also just, as I said, lip service. It might not be genuine engagement. So what concrete measures, I guess, do you guys want to see to decolonize conservation, I guess? Thanks.
Yeah, if I could directly answer to that. Sorry, I jumped in front of Sarah. But I think it's a question I have asked myself as well, because I studied a master's in conservation management as well, and I studied that in the UK with a focus on really local ecosystems. So during all of my studies, I heard very, very little about the racist past and present, the neo-colonial aspects of conservation in other continents, about the economic system and how that connects to nature protection. So I do totally recognize that point, because that's my own experience as well, that this was not really part of what we were taught at the university. And I think there is room to improve. So maybe if some of you start to teach, become lecturers, or do any courses, maybe you can include that at some point and improve it. Or maybe you could look for possibilities to bring some economic professionals and have them teach some basics, or have courses or possibilities to educate people in that sphere. what I found very interesting as well is that many students who are extremely keen to do something great for nature conservation are not aware of what the industry is doing. So they're very well-meaning, but they just don't know. And they would be, I think most of them would be horrified if they knew what's happening, and they would want to improve. So I think we would have to engage them and find ways for them to improve the industry that they are part of. And what I think is interesting is that in other sectors, there have been student-led campaigns to make those improvements, for example, or like to push an industry. Could be examples from the US about law firms, where law students, for example, have rated top law firms about their climate policies and which clients they're taking on, for example. So then students decided not to work for certain employers anymore because they had a bad history working for oil firms, and no students wanted to work for these organizations anymore. Or the same for marketing. So students have rated certain marketing employers, checking if they cooperate with destructive businesses and so on, and targeting those students who are just about to graduate. And I think in the conservation world as well, not only do we need to educate the wider public, we also would critically, I think, need to engage the students. And I think that most of them really would be very, very keen to work in organizations which are not engaged in human rights abuses and who are respecting indigenous peoples and working together with them. So I think here is another critical step for improving the current situation. And I'd be really keen to see some campaigns coming out targeted particularly at young people and students in conservation studies.
Is it okay if I jump?
Yes. That was unfortunate. You want to try again, Sarah?
Yeah, apologies for that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that question to me, I agree with what you were saying, Carola, and I think the question that you posed, Maria, actually hides a much more exciting question to me, which I think is, what is the relationship between science and politics, and science and society? Sort of thing, which I think might even be an even more interesting, sort of a deeper, more critical, more transformative question that we can ask here, because in a
And maybe on that note, well, we are approaching the end of the time for this workshop. Let us see if there is one last pressing question or comment.
I just want to comment that it seems with the last question of the last speaker, who sadly jumped away again, but it seems that the aspect that Otero also emphasized, that we have to reflect upon ourselves and as scientists as well, and how we are engaged in this whole field of through our analysis and through all our systemic thinking, that is a very fundamental element, as well as educating more holistically about this theme. So I find it very interesting, insightful.
Thank you, Kenneth. I agree. It has been a very insightful and discussion-inspiring session. Let us enjoy a bit of a longer break and reconvene at 2 o'clock.